There's a particular kind of silence that happens right before your whole world tips over. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's just quiet. And that night, sitting at my brother's engagement dinner in a dress my mother picked out for me because she said my own choices were too much, I felt that silence settle over the table like a held breath. My name is Naomi. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, I was the daughter who apologized for existing too loudly. The one who learned early that love in my family came with conditions, and the biggest condition of all was, don't embarrass us. I heard that phrase more times than I can count growing up. Don't embarrass us at church. Don't embarrass us in front of the neighbors. Don't embarrass us at your cousin's wedding. It became less of a warning and more of a leash, one I wore so long I forgot it was even there. But that night, the night of my brother Adam's engagement dinner, my mother said it to me one more time, right before the appetizers arrived, and she had no idea, none at all, what I was carrying in the silence behind my smile. Let me take you back. Not just to that dinner, but to the years that built up to it, because betrayal doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in 1,000 small ones, stacked so quietly you don't notice the weight until you're standing under it, wondering why you can barely breathe. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. My father, Richard, was a respected accountant, the kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered your birthday. My mother, Diane, ran that household like a general runs a campaign, every detail curated, every appearance managed. And at the center of it all was my younger brother, Adam. Golden Adam. The son who could do no wrong. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's simply true, and understanding it is the only way you'll understand what happened next. Adam was 2 years younger than me, but from the moment he was born, something shifted in our house. I remember it faintly, the way my mother's eyes would light up differently when she looked at him, the way my father would take him fishing on weekends while I stayed home to help around the house. I told myself it was normal. Every family has a favorite, right? I told myself that lie for 25 years. By the time I was in college, the pattern was so entrenched I didn't even question it anymore. Adam got the new car. I got the hand-me-down. Adam's grades, even when they were mediocre, were framed as he's just finding his path. My grades, even when they were excellent, were met with, that's nice, but don't get a big head about it. I want to be clear about something, because this isn't a story about hating my brother. Adam and I were actually close, in our own complicated way. He knew, on some level, that things were unequal. Sometimes he'd slip me extra cash when our parents weren't looking, or cover for me when I broke curfew. He wasn't cruel. He was just comfortable. Comfortable in a system that worked in his favor, the way people often are. The real architect of our family's imbalance was my mother. Diane is the woman obsessed with image. She didn't just want a good family. She wanted a family that looked good, that photographed well, that made other mothers jealous at the country club. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being her daughter and started being a variable in an equation she was trying to solve. How do I make this family look successful? How do I make sure nothing embarrasses us? I left home at 22 and moved 3 states away, ostensibly for a job opportunity, but really because I needed air. I needed to breathe somewhere my worth wasn't measured against my brother's shine. And for a few years, it worked. I built a life. I built a career in logistics management, something steady and respectable, though never quite impressive enough for my mother's dinner party stories. I built friendships with people who liked me for reasons that had nothing to do with how well I represented a family brand. But you can't outrun blood completely. Not when there are weddings, and funerals, and engagement dinners. Which brings me back to that night. Adam had proposed to his girlfriend, Bianca, 3 months earlier, a woman my mother adored on sight, mostly because Bianca's family owned 2 car dealerships and a chain of dry cleaners. My mother had never asked about my relationships with that much enthusiasm. She'd never once asked what Bianca did for work, what she believed in, what kind of person she was underneath the surface. She just asked what Bianca's family was worth. The engagement dinner was held at the Aldridge, an upscale restaurant downtown with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than most novels. My mother had spent weeks planning it. She'd hired a florist. She'd coordinated a color scheme. She'd sent me 3 separate texts about what I should and shouldn't wear, culminating in her buying me a dress herself, a modest, forgettable navy blue thing that, in her words, won't draw attention away from Bianca. I remember standing in the bathroom of my apartment before I left, staring at myself in that dress, and feeling something I hadn't expected. Not sadness. Not even anger, exactly. Just a strange, quiet clarity. Because 2 weeks before that dinner, I had learned something. Something that changed the entire shape of what I understood about my family, about my mother, about the golden narrative she'd spent 30 years constructing. I'm not going to tell you what it was yet. Not because I want to be cruel with the suspense, but because I need you to understand what it felt like to walk into that restaurant already knowing, while everyone else around that table believed they were simply celebrating an engagement. I arrived 15 minutes early, as instructed. My mother greeted me at the entrance with a critical once-over, adjusting the collar of my dress like I was a mannequin she was dressing for a store window. "You look fine," she said, which from her was practically a compliment. "Just remember tonight isn't about you. Don't embarrass us. Bianca's parents are very particular people." I smiled a small, tight smile and said, "I know, Mom. I'll behave." She had no idea how loaded that sentence really was. Because sitting 2 tables away, waiting to be seated with the rest of the guests, was a man my mother hadn't seen in 11 years. A man she'd once known intimately, in every sense of that word. A man whose presence at that dinner was not a coincidence, but something I had arranged myself, with a phone call 2 weeks prior that had taken every ounce of courage I had. They called him Colonel Whitfield. Retired military, sharp posture, a face that carried both authority and quiet sorrow. And when my mother finally saw him, when her eyes landed on his face across that beautifully decorated room, I watched 30 years of careful image management crack down the middle in real time. But we'll get there. Let me first tell you how I found out. Let me tell you what it felt like to discover, at 31 years old, that the family I'd spent my whole life trying to be worthy of was built on a foundation of lies so deep I hadn't even known to look for them. It started with a box. 6 weeks before the engagement dinner, my father asked me to help clean out the attic of my childhood home. He developed some knee problems and could no longer manage the narrow attic stairs, and my mother, predictably, refused to ruin her manicure doing manual labor. So it fell to me, the dutiful daughter, to spend a Saturday afternoon sorting through 3 decades of accumulated family history. Most of what I found was mundane. Old tax documents. Christmas ornaments. A box of my childhood report cards that, notably, my mother had never once displayed on the refrigerator the way she displayed Adam's. And then, tucked into the back corner behind a stack of moldering encyclopedias, I found a shoebox tied shut with a faded ribbon. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't hidden particularly well, just forgotten, the way things get forgotten when nobody expects anyone to go looking. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, written in handwriting I didn't recognize, dated across a span of years that started roughly 2 years before I was born and continued for almost a decade after. I want to be honest with you about what I felt reading them, because it wasn't dramatic at first. It was confusion. Then it was a slow, creeping recognition, like watching fog lift off a landscape you thought you knew and realizing the shape of the hills was different than you remembered. The letters were from a man named Elias Whitfield. And they were love letters. Real ones. Not the kind people write casually, the kind that carry years of history, private jokes, references to moments only 2 people who loved each other deeply would understand. They were addressed to my mother. But what I didn't know that day, sitting cross-legged on that dusty attic floor with letters spread across my lap, was how deep this went. I thought, at first, that I'd stumbled onto evidence of an affair. Painful, certainly. Complicated, certainly. But something in the past, something that could maybe stay in the past. Until I found the letter dated 8 months before my birth. In it, Elias wrote about a decision my mother had made. A decision to stay with my father, to protect the family image, to protect the child. He wrote about his heartbreak, his understanding, his hope that someday, if circumstances ever allowed, he might know the truth about who that child grew up to be. I sat in that attic for almost 2 hours before I could move. I won't lie to you and pretend I processed it calmly. My hands were shaking. My chest felt like it had been hollowed out and refilled with something heavier than air. Because suddenly, 31 years of feeling like the family's afterthought, the family's disappointment, the family's less loved child, started to make a different kind of sense. What if I wasn't just less favored? What if I was never entirely who I thought I was? I didn't confront my mother right away. I want you to understand that about me, I'm not someone who acts on raw emotion. I sat with those letters for 3 days before I did anything, running through every possible explanation, trying to talk myself out of what felt increasingly undeniable. But the math was too precise to ignore. The dates. The language. The specific tenderness of a man clearly grieving a life he wasn't allowed to be part of. I did what I do best when my world falls apart. I got quiet and I got methodical. The first thing I did was a DNA test. I know how that sounds, how clinical, how almost cold. But I needed facts before I let myself feel anything real. I ordered one of those consumer genetic testing kits, spit into a tube in my apartment bathroom with my hands trembling, and sent it off, and then I waited 6 of the longest weeks of my life. While I waited, I did something else. I found Elias Whitfield. It wasn't hard. His name was distinctive enough, and the letters mentioned enough details: his military service, a base he'd been stationed at, a hometown, that a few evenings of careful searching led me to a public records profile, and eventually, a phone number. I sat with that phone number for 4 days before I called it. When he answered, his voice was exactly what I imagined from the letters. Measured. A little weathered. The voice of someone who had learned to carry disappointment quietly, the way soldiers learn to carry most things. Hello, this is Elias. I didn't know how to start. I remember my voice cracking on the first word. Hi. My name is Naomi. I think you might have known my mother. Diane. There was a long silence on the other end. Long enough that I thought he might hang up. Diane Ashford, he finally said. Not a question. A statement, heavy with recognition. My mother's maiden name, spoken by a man who apparently hadn't said it out loud in a very long time. Yes, I said. That's her. Another silence. And then, quietly, almost like he was afraid to hope, what's your birthday? I told him. And I heard him exhale, long and slow, like a breath he'd been holding for 31 years. We talked for almost 3 hours that first call. He told me things I'd never known, that he and my mother had been together for almost 4 years before I was born, that they'd planned a life together, that my mother had gotten pregnant during a period when my father, whom she was still technically seeing on and off, had been pressuring her toward marriage for the sake of stability and family expectations. Elias told me he'd begged her to choose differently. He told me she'd cried, told him she loved him, and then chosen the safer, more respectable path anyway, marrying my father just 2 months before I was born, letting everyone, including eventually me, believe I was his. He told me about the letters he kept writing for years afterward, letters he mailed care of a friend who would pass them along quietly, because Diane had asked him never to contact the house directly. He told me about the ache of watching birthdays pass that he wasn't invited to, of driving past the elementary school once, years ago, hoping for a glimpse of a little girl he'd never been allowed to know. I always wondered, he said toward the end of that call, his voice thick with something I recognized because I felt it too. I always wondered who you became. The DNA results came back 5 weeks later. 99.7% probability of paternity. Elias Whitfield was my biological father. Richard, the man who raised me, who I called Dad, who I'd spent my whole life trying and failing to make proud, he wasn't my father at all. He was, as far as I could piece together, a man who may have known, on some level, deep down, that something didn't add up, but who chose, like my mother, to protect the image over the truth. I want to pause here and tell you honestly, this wasn't a moment of triumph. This wasn't me punching the air, feeling vindicated, feeling free. It was devastating. It cracked open a version of myself I'd spent 31 years building on a foundation that turned out to be sand. Every memory recalibrated itself. Every moment my mother favored Adam over me suddenly had a different, sharper edge. Was it just favoritism? Or was there something more specific happening, some subconscious resentment toward the daughter who represented the choice she didn't make, the love she abandoned, the life she walked away from? I'll never know for certain. My mother has never been the type to examine her own psychology out loud. But I started to understand, for the first time, that my exclusion in that family wasn't random. It was rooted in something she buried so deep she probably told herself she'd forgotten it entirely. Until I dug it back up. The weeks after I learned the truth were some of the hardest of my life. I went through what I can only describe as a slow unraveling. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped returning my mother's calls with the same eager, hopeful energy I always had, the energy of a daughter still trying to earn something that, I now understood, might never have been mine to earn in the first place. I talked to Elias almost every day during that stretch. He became, in a strange and unexpected way, the parent I'd always needed, someone who asked about my life with genuine curiosity, who remembered small details I mentioned once, who didn't measure my worth against anyone else's. We met in person for the first time about 4 weeks after that initial phone call, at a quiet diner halfway between our two cities. I recognized him before he even stood up. Something in the shape of his face, the set of his shoulders, features I'd apparently inherited without ever knowing their source. We hugged for a long time before either of us said anything. And when we finally sat down, he looked at me with an expression I'd rarely seen directed at me in my entire life. Pure, uncomplicated pride. "You built a good life," he said. "I can see that. I'm so proud of you, and I didn't even get to help." I cried in that diner booth like I hadn't cried in years. Because it was the first time someone in my bloodline had looked at me and simply been glad I existed, without conditions, without comparisons, without a leash made of expectation. Over the following weeks, Elias told me more about his life. He'd never married. He'd built a respected career in the military, eventually earning the rank of colonel before retiring 6 years earlier. He lived a quiet life, but he had resources, connections, and, I slowly realized, a very particular kind of resolve. Not anger, exactly. Something steadier than anger. A soldier's patience. I told him about the family I'd grown up in. About my mother's obsession with image, about the years of feeling like an afterthought, about the golden treatment Adam always received. I told him about the engagement dinner that was coming up, about how my mother had already started sending me passive-aggressive texts about appropriate dress codes and appropriate behavior. And that's when something shifted in the conversation. Elias grew quiet for a moment, and then he asked me a question that changed the trajectory of everything that came next. "Do you want them to know the truth?" I sat with that question for a long time. Because there were two paths in front of me, and I understood, even then, that choosing one meant closing the door on the other permanently. I could keep this truth private. I could quietly step back from the family, let my relationship with Elias grow in its own separate space, and simply fade from the periphery of the Ashford family narrative without ever forcing a confrontation. It would be easier, in some ways. Quieter. Less explosive. Or I could bring the truth into the light, not out of cruelty, but out of a deep, aching need to finally be seen accurately. To stop being measured against a standard I was never actually competing in. To make my mother face, in front of the people whose opinions she valued more than her own daughter's heart, the choice she'd made 3 decades earlier and the cost she'd extracted from me to keep it hidden. I won't pretend the second option wasn't also, in part, about consequence. About justice. I'd spent 31 years being told not to embarrass my family, while my mother's own hidden choices were the single most embarrassing, most consequential secret sitting quietly in that household's foundation. I thought about all the moments I could have used context for, moments that suddenly made painful sense. The way my mother sometimes looked at me like I reminded her of something she didn't want to remember. The way she'd occasionally slip and call me by a name that wasn't mine, quickly correcting herself, blaming exhaustion. I wondered now if that name had belonged to someone else, maybe a version of the life she imagined she might have had, with Elias, in some other timeline she'd cut herself off from. I decided I wanted the truth to come out. But I wanted it to come out on my terms, in a way that couldn't be spun, managed, or buried the way my mother buried everything inconvenient. Which meant I needed a witness who couldn't be dismissed. I needed the truth to arrive in a room full of people whose opinions mattered enormously to my mother, the very same room she'd spent weeks curating to protect her image. I needed Elias at that engagement dinner. When I asked him, I expected hesitation. Instead, he simply nodded, like he'd been waiting 31 years for someone to finally ask. "I won't make a scene," he told me. "I won't embarrass you. I'll just be there. And if she asks me to leave, I'll leave. But I think it's time she remembers that some choices don't stay buried just because you want them to." We planned it carefully over the following 2 weeks. I found out, through some careful questioning of the restaurant's event coordinator, pretending I was helping my mother finalize seating, that there would be an open cocktail hour before the seated dinner, where guests mingled freely. Elias would arrive during that window, dressed appropriately, listed on a small addendum to the guest list I quietly submitted myself, claiming he was a family friend from my father's old army days, a detail I knew my mother wouldn't verify closely, since she rarely bothered to double-check anything that didn't directly reflect on her. I didn't tell my father any of this. Honestly, I still don't fully know how to feel about Richard in all of this. He raised me. He showed up to my school plays and helped me with math homework and taught me to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings. Whatever the biology says, there's a version of fatherhood he actually gave me, however unevenly distributed compared to what he gave Adam. I wasn't trying to punish him. I was trying to finally understand my mother, and to stop absorbing blame for a dynamic I never had the full picture of. The night before the dinner, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at my ceiling, running through every possible way the evening could unfold. Would my mother deny it? Would she cry? Would she turn it around and somehow make herself the victim, the way she always did when accountability got too close? I thought about calling the whole thing off more than once. But then I thought about that phrase, "Don't embarrass us," and how many times I'd swallowed my own feelings, my own needs, my own truth, to protect a family image that had never once protected me in return. I decided I was done shrinking. The engagement dinner started exactly the way my mother had planned it, elegant, controlled, photographable. Waiters circulated with champagne. Bianca's parents held court near the floral centerpiece, discussing dealership expansion plans with anyone who'd listen. Adam looked genuinely happy, and for a moment, watching him laugh with Bianca, I felt a pang of guilt about what was coming. But then my mother approached me at the edge of the room, straightened my collar again, a habit I now understood as control disguised as care, and said the words that had shaped my entire life one final time. "Remember, Naomi. Don't embarrass us." I smiled. "I won't, Mom. I promise." And I meant it, in a strange way. Because what happened next wasn't going to be my embarrassment to own. I saw Elias arrive at exactly 7:15, right on schedule, dressed in a simple charcoal suit, his posture unmistakably military, shoulders squared, chin level, The bearing of a man who'd spent decades being disciplined about exactly this kind of moment. He found me near the bar area and gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "I'm ready whenever you are." I watched my mother's eyes sweep the room the way they always did at events like this, cataloging, assessing, making sure every element matched the picture in her head. And then her eyes landed on him. I have never, in 31 years, seen my mother's face do what it did in that moment. The color didn't just drain from her cheeks, it seemed to drain from the entire room around her. Her champagne glass tilted slightly in her hand, and for a second I thought she might drop it entirely. "Elias," she said. Barely a whisper, but I was close enough to hear it. He walked toward her with the calm, measured pace of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind over 11 years and had finally arrived at it. "Hello, Diane," he said. "It's been a long time." My mother's composure, the armor she'd worn her entire adult life, cracked visibly. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, glancing around to see who might be watching, who might be listening, who might be witnessing the exact thing she'd spent 31 years preventing. "I was invited," Elias said simply. "By your daughter." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. My mother's eyes snapped to me, and in that instant, I watched 3 decades of carefully maintained denial collapse in real time. "Naomi," she said, her voice tight, controlled, the tone she used when she was trying desperately not to make a scene in public. "What is this?" I felt something steady settle inside me. Not anger, exactly. Not triumph either. Something closer to clarity, the same clarity I'd felt standing in my bathroom mirror weeks earlier in that navy blue dress she'd chosen for me. "This is Elias Whitfield," I said, keeping my voice calm, even, pitched just loud enough for the small cluster of nearby guests to hear without turning it into a spectacle. "My biological father." I want you to understand, I didn't scream it. I didn't cry. I said it the way you'd state any simple fact, because after everything I'd learned, that's exactly what it was. A fact. One my mother had spent my entire life trying to erase. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it was probably only seconds. Bianca's mother, standing nearby, turned with wide, curious eyes. Adam, catching the tension from across the room, started making his way over, his easy smile fading into confusion. My mother's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, fury, and finally, a kind of desperate, brittle composure, the last defense of a woman who had built her entire identity around never being caught. "This is not the time or place," she said through gritted teeth, her eyes darting around the room, gauging exactly how many witnesses had heard. "You're right," I said quietly. "It's not. But you didn't give me a better one in 31 years, Mom. You just kept telling me not to embarrass you. So I figured tonight was as good a night as any to finally tell the truth." My father, Richard, appeared at my mother's side then, his expression shifting from polite host to visibly alarmed. "Diane, what's going on? Who is this?" And here's the part that told me everything I needed to know about the years that came before. My mother didn't answer him. She looked at Elias, then at me, then, briefly, at Richard, and I watched her actually calculate, in real time, at her son's engagement dinner, which version of the truth would cost her the least. "I can explain," she finally said, but her voice had lost all its usual command. "You don't have to explain to me," I said. "I already know. I've known for weeks. I just think it's time everyone else did too, since apparently the truth was always too embarrassing for private conversation. Maybe it'll go down easier with champagne." I know how that line sounds, a little sharp, maybe even a little cruel. I won't pretend I didn't feel some satisfaction saying it. 31 years of swallowed words have to go somewhere eventually. Elias, for his part, remained composed throughout, exactly as he promised he would. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, steady, present, a living, breathing consequence of a choice my mother thought she'd successfully buried. I'm not here to ruin anyone's night, he said, addressing the small, stunned circle that had gathered. I just wanted to finally meet my daughter's family. She's an incredible woman. I think that says a lot about how she was raised, regardless of the complicated parts. That kindness, honestly, hit harder than any accusation could have. Because it highlighted something my mother's entire value system had always missed, that grace and honesty aren't opposites. You can tell the truth and still choose not to be cruel about it. My mother didn't have a response for that. For maybe the first time in her adult life, Diane Ashford was completely, utterly speechless. The rest of the dinner didn't unfold the way anyone had planned, least of all my mother. Some guests quietly left early, murmuring polite excuses. Bianca's parents exchanged uncomfortable glances but, to their credit, didn't make a bigger deal of it than necessary. They'd clearly absorbed enough family drama in their own circles to recognize when to stay out of someone else's. Adam pulled me aside at one point, his face a complicated mix of shock and something softer. "Is it true?" he asked. "It's true," I said. DNA confirmed and everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You're still my sister. That doesn't change anything for me." It was the kindest thing anyone in that family had said to me in years, and it came from the person my mother had spent 3 decades favoring over me. I think that's the moment I finally let go of some of the resentment I'd carried toward him, because he chose, in that instant, to see me clearly, without the family's usual filters. My mother found me alone near the coat check about an hour later, after most of the shock had settled into a simmering, humiliated quiet. Her makeup had smudged slightly, the first imperfection I'd seen on her in years. "You planned this," she said. "Not a question." "I did," I said. "You could have talked to me privately. You didn't have to do this in front of everyone." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. "You spent my whole life telling me not to embarrass you in front of everyone. I think some part of me needed you to understand what that actually feels like, being reduced to a controlled variable in someone else's image. I didn't do this to destroy you, Mom. I did it because I was done shrinking myself to protect a lie you told to protect your own comfort." She didn't have an answer for that either. And for the first time in my life, I watched my mother sit in silence instead of controlling the narrative. I won't tell you the aftermath was neat or immediately healing, because it wasn't. My relationship with my mother has been distant and strained in the months since. We're still, cautiously, working out what, if anything, remains salvageable between us. Some days I think there's a version of reconciliation possible, once the wound scar's over enough for both of us to look at it honestly. Other days I'm not sure I want that reconciliation at all, and I've had to make peace with the fact that it's okay not to know yet. My relationship with Richard has actually deepened in unexpected ways. He came to me privately, weeks later, and admitted he'd always had quiet suspicions but chose not to pursue them, afraid of what he might lose. He apologized, genuinely, tearfully, for the years he let my mother's favoritism toward Adam go unchecked, even if he hadn't understood the deeper root of it. He's still my dad, in every way that matters. Biology complicated the story, but it didn't erase the parts of fatherhood he actually gave me. And Elias has become one of the steadiest, most unconditionally supportive presences in my life. We have dinner every few weeks now. He tells me stories about his years of service, and I tell him about my work, my friends, the small victories of an ordinary life he missed the first 3 decades of and is determined not to miss another day of now. He never once asked me to choose sides in my family's complicated aftermath. He just showed up, consistently, the way he'd apparently always wanted to. Adam and Bianca got married 4 months later. I stood in that wedding as his sister, unconditionally, and I meant it more fully than I ever had before, because for the first time, that role wasn't tangled up in comparison or competition. It was just love, uncomplicated by the family hierarchy that had shaped so much of my childhood. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I've thought about it a lot, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath, it's this: the truths we bury to protect an image never actually stay buried. They wait. They grow roots in the silence we build around them. And eventually, they surface, usually at the exact moment we're least prepared for them, because that's the nature of things we refuse to face. They don't disappear. They just wait for the right room, the right witness, the right moment of courage to finally step into the light. My mother spent 31 years terrified of being embarrassed. What she never understood is that the truth was never the embarrassing part. It was the hiding that cost her everything: a daughter's trust, a family's honesty, and ultimately, the version of herself she might have been if she'd simply chosen courage over image, all those years ago. As for me, I've stopped shrinking. I've stopped waiting for a family that measured my worth in comparison to someone else to finally see me clearly. I found that clarity somewhere I never expected: in a shoebox of old letters, in a phone call that shook with 31 years of hope, in a quiet man's steady voice saying, I know now. And for the first time in my life, I like her.